Welcome to Module 3. This module will focus on the collection of useful and relevant data with appropriate tools, assessment for, as, and of learning within the FSL context, accommodations and modifications, and the communication of student learning. In this module, we are defining useful and relevant data so that we can capture an accurate picture of student proficiency and competency in French, creating curriculum-based learning goals and success criteria so that we can set students up for success with an understanding of their goals and the means to achieve them. Discussing descriptive feedback so that we can engage students and teachers in assessment for and as learning while increasing student confidence in French. Exploring accommodations and modifications so that we can meet the needs of all students in the FSL classroom. And investigating assessment of learning so that we can communicate the evaluation of student proficiency, competency, and achievement in FSL. It is important to gather data that shows evidence of student learning across the 4 strands of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. In a program that places emphasis on oral communication, educators must collect a variety of useful and relevant data. With the emphasis placed heavily on oral communication, particularly at the early stages of learning, FSL educators cannot rely on traditional methods of data collection, such as tests and worksheets. Therefore, they must find the means to collect useful and relevant data from authentic learning tasks in innovative ways. Useful and relevant data is collected in a variety of situations over time, with the focus being on the most consistent and most recent. The use of triangulation ensures that educators are collecting from multiple sources, and when possible, from authentic, real-world, and connected experiences. In planning, learning goals are aligned with success criteria and curriculum expectations. Goals are written in student-friendly French, that is, using word cognates and familiar words to create conditions for the provision of successful evidence. Students work through educator feedback, as well as peer and self-assessment, to improve upon their learning. Educators then set goals for next steps and incrementally challenge students to aid them in the accomplishment of their learning goals and to inform their teaching. FSL-specific examples of useful and relevant data come from tasks that are meaningful for students and through which they can demonstrate their abilities in French. In Module 2, we learned that action-oriented tasks provide for meaningful and spontaneous opportunities for students. They are open-ended and involve the construction of a response. A checklist highlighting specific look-fors can be used to assess oral proficiency during conversations and dialogues, both rehearsed and spontaneous, with educators and amongst peers. The educator can also observe active listening activities and games and assign purposeful performance tasks. They can look at samples of written work and journal entries, observe reading behaviors, and explore the results of surveys and exit cards. Data that is not useful and relevant comes from assessment methods where students can perform effectively in communication situations without being required to apply their French language skills. Some non-examples include the use of traditional dictées to assess writing, or the reading of fill-in-the-blanks to assess oral communication. The assessment goal must be reflected in the results. For example, if the goal of a listening comprehension activity is to write words heard, spelling should not be assessed. The collection of data can be challenging in the FSL context as educators are often working with several classes and attempting to collect evidence of communicative proficiency. Student portfolios become particularly important in gathering evidence of learning across all 4 competencies. Portfolios show authentic evidence of learning and allow students to choose the work they want to showcase. Some of the means of data collection include rubrics, success criteria, checklists, anecdotal notes in the form of post-its or charts, and exit cards. These can be kept in folders or binders as student portfolios to show a representation of the learning that students have accomplished over time. Another option is to take photographs of these items and keep them in a digital collection. The range of assessment data that can be collected grows with the digital collection as educators can include video and audio submissions, blogs and vlogs, and evidence of interactive communication through platforms such as Flipgrid and Google Classroom. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. Assessment for learning is the process of seeking and interpreting evidence that accurately reflects how well a student is achieving the curriculum expectations in a subject or course. When reflecting on the information collected, both students and educators decide where students are in their learning, where they need to go, and how best to get there. To ensure that assessment is valid and reliable and leads to the improvement of learning for students in FSL, educators use practices that are fair, transparent, and equitable. An essential step is the sharing of learning goals and success criteria. Research shows that setting clear learning goals for students has a high probability of increasing student learning by as much as 15%. The learning goal clarifies the purpose and content of the learning. It describes the essential knowledge and skills that are aligned with curriculum expectations. The learning goal is always written in French in student-friendly language and may include pictures to support meaning. When first introduced, deconstructing the learning goal through questioning is an instructional strategy that encourages students to participate in the assessment process. The educator then introduces the success criteria describing to the students what successful learning looks like to achieve the learning goal. Also written in French, they identify what students are expected to be able to know and be able to do based on curriculum expectations. Educators create success criteria intentionally balancing the achievement chart categories of knowledge and understanding, thinking, communication, and application. Educators can either decide to develop the success criteria on their own and then communicate them to students, or they can co-construct the success criteria with the students using different instructional strategies. The success criteria are modeled, used, and referred to over time during explicit teaching. Students may be invited to edit the success criteria as they apply them to their learning. Engaging students with learning goals and success criteria pulls them into the assessment process and empowers them to own their learning. Learning goals are aligned with the FSL Ontario curriculum, which outlines the concepts and competencies and/or skills that are required to be taught, assessed, and evaluated by educators. The example presented here is from the FSL curriculum, Grade 8 Extended French, Overall Writing Expectation D1. In the language of the curriculum, the disciplinary concepts are identified by nouns highlighted in green, whereas the competencies and skills, what students will do to show their understanding, are identified by verbs highlighted in pink. There are several ways to write learning goals. It is important to be consistent with one's choice of words so that students eventually recognize the statements and are able to use them when speaking French. This example starts with, "We are learning to." Both the concept and competency and/or skill are included in the learning goal in student-friendly language. It is stated as a learning experience in which students will engage. Here, they will communicate in writing for a specific reason and to a particular audience. In order to achieve this goal, students are given a choice of both subject matter and ways to communicate their learning based on their interests, background knowledge, and educational needs. During planning sessions, educators will determine what explicit teaching, supports, and strategies are needed for groups of students to understand and achieve the learning goal. Throughout the learning experience, the learning goal is provided for students' reference. Reconnecting with the learning goal often will support students to reflect on their progress, next steps, and strategies. There are many practical routines educators can use to re-engage students in the conversation, either as a whole group, in pairs, or one-on-one. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. Based on the learning goal, how are success criteria then developed in French? Educators choose no more than 2 or 3 specific expectations from the FSL curriculum to identify the criteria aligned with the learning goal. In our Grade 8 Extended French example, the 2 specific expectations can lead to a number of select, prioritized success criteria, which educators can use to assess student learning. When developing success criteria, educators may refer to the CEFR, the Common European Framework of Reference for Languages. The CEFR is an international standard for describing language ability. It describes language ability on a 6-point scale from A1 for beginners up to C2 for those who have mastered a language. The philosophy of the A1 to B2 levels are embedded within the FSL curriculum. The competencies of listening, speaking, reading, and writing are weighted differently throughout the grades. In the early years of language learning, listening and speaking are the focus of language acquisition. This is because oral skills are the foundation for the development of reading and writing. It is not until senior secondary when they are weighted equally. Students are therefore given many opportunities to develop French oral language skills before writing is assessed. Similar to learning goals, success criteria are written in French in student-friendly language and usually begin with "I can" statements, taking the student's perspective into account. The first criteria is taken from the FSL curriculum, emphasizing that students can receive support from the teacher to determine their purpose for writing and the audience for French texts they plan to create. The second criteria comes directly from the CEFR. They provide examples of what types of creative writing students are able to produce at the A2 level, such as imaginary biographies and short and simple poems about people. Some explicit teaching and context to students' writing would be included to build on their skills. For example, students might begin by writing their own diary entries related to their everyday life before moving on to imaginary biographies. The third criteria also comes from the CEFR and states that students can write a series of simple phrases and sentences linked with simple connectors at the A2 level. The CEFR focuses on students' ability to convey a message as a whole. Since the CFR is a language continuum, educators can differentiate by choosing success criteria from any of the 4 language levels, thereby meeting students' zone of proximal development and language learning. As part of assessment for learning, educators provide students with descriptive feedback and coaching for improvement. Research has indicated that a climate of trust where students feel that they can make mistakes without being judged and evaluated is the basis for students applying any feedback to their learning. Therefore, marks are not given to students at this time. Instead, educators provide students with feedback detailing how they are progressing towards the established learning goal. Descriptive feedback should be accessible and framed in French language that students can understand and find meaningful in their work. It must be clear and specific, focused on a few important points related to the learning goal. Afterwards, students need ample time to apply any specific feedback before evaluation takes place. Collaborative assessment also involves giving students one another feedback in French. Assessment as learning is when students reflect on each other's learning styles and then reconnect back to their own. It is through self-reflection that students develop an awareness of the language strategies that work best for them. The development of metacognitive skills is pivotal in students becoming more skilled at adjusting the quality of their work while increasing the awareness of their language abilities. When an educator gives descriptive feedback to a student, specific steps are generally followed. First, the educator begins by highlighting the student's strengths. In this case, the educator shares the student's ability to include an introduction to a friend's birthday card and also shares how he was able to explain why he likes his friend. Then the educator focuses on an area for improvement. He asks him to clarify one of his thoughts related to why his friend is important to him. It is through this conversation with the educator that the student is given the opportunity to develop his thoughts. The educator uses this teachable moment to give the student the vocabulary needed to express his thinking in French. The student would then include his newly developed thoughts in writing. Finally, the educator focuses on the student's next steps. As the student did not complete one of the success criteria, the educator invites the student to reread the instructions to see what is missing in his message. The educator would give him time to figure this out for himself before prompting him with a direct question. By giving the student descriptive feedback, the educator not only supports the student in the development of his thoughts and writing, but indirectly helps him to meet the required number of words in his writing response. There are a number of strategies for providing feedback to students. It can be oral feedback given in French through conversation, or it can be given in writing. This latter approach allows educators time to reflect on student work and focus on their next steps. There are many assessment strategies that can be used, such as the Met, Not Yet Met, I Notice strategy, which is a checklist with a space for comments. 2 stars and a wish highlights 2 successes and 1 next step for individuals or groups of students. The single point rubric gives students written feedback and next steps related to each success criteria. And EduGains provides models of descriptive feedback that educators can access online. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. One of the guiding principles of FSL programs is that they are for all students. Participation in FSL programs should reflect the diversity of the student population, including students with special education needs and students who are English language learners. Educators, administrators, Parents and even students themselves should be involved in the process of creating a successful learning environment for every student. Information and ideas specific to the FSL program can be found in the Ministry of Education document, including students with special education needs in French as a second language programs. As with every subject taught, educators must determine where their students are in their learning journey, their next steps, and goals so that they can experience success. Starting with the principles of universal design, educators can ensure that their classrooms are accessible for all learners and that they have an understanding that all of their students can be successful. Differentiated instruction ensures that educators are meeting students at their level and encourages progression. In cases where a student requires more specific support in learning, an accommodated IEP can be implemented and is preferable to modification when appropriate to meet student needs. In FSL, modified expectations for most students with special education needs will be based on regular grade-level curriculum with an increase or decrease in the number and/or complexity of expectations. For example, we could take expectation C1.2, Reading for Meaning, from the grade 7 French immersion curriculum. One way that this expectation can be modified is by changing the complexity of the expectation, therefore removing qualifiers such as intent, variety, and academic, and ensuring that the student always has access to support. In keeping with the goals of the FSL curriculum and the CFR, the qualifiers that the text is familiar and personally relevant are kept. In cases where an individual education plan is required, FSL educators must be involved in the process in order to accommodate or modify for the students they are teaching. Accommodations and modifications must be considered throughout the planning and teaching process, including in the cycle of feedback and goal setting. The inclusion of all students in FSL applies also to English language learners. Research has shown that English language learners do as well or outperform English-speaking students in FSL. Every student has the right to access second language learning, and with intentional support, all students can be successful in FSL. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. When determining a student's evaluation, educators must use professional judgment in considering how students best demonstrate their learning. They must take into account a variety of means of evaluation, provide multiple opportunities for the demonstration of learning, and ensure that they are evaluating all 4 competencies. The triangulation model has educators consider student products, but also includes observations and conversations. Observations can be formal and informal and could include taking risks, listening attentively to directions, using new vocabulary, use of French in pairs and small group activities, and more. They can be recorded as developmental continua, documentation, rubrics, anecdotal notes, checklists, running records, lists, notes from literacy circles, and so much more. Conversation is vital to assessment in the second language classroom as students speak, listen, and interact, but can also provide information to inform the assessment of written interaction. Some examples of conversation include conferences, notes, journals, blogs, moderated online forums, focused conversation, peer and self-assessment, self-reflection, and educator feedback. Gathering of observational and conversational data must be organized in order to ensure that all students are assessed over time. An educator may choose to target a few students each day in order to capture evidence. With students working in small groups, an educator may choose to focus on one student in each group. The use of technology affords the FSL educator time to review observations and conversations, however, should be used strategically so that it does not become burdensome. Student products often seem like the most straightforward means of assessment, however, can be challenging in the FSL classroom with its focus on oral communication, authentic learning situations, and meaningful tasks through which students can demonstrate their proficiency in their second language. Some examples are demonstrations, projects, portfolios, performances, essays, response journals, graphic organizers, interviews, short and impromptu speeches, videos, and tests. Grade, program, and proficiency, as well as differentiation, will result in emphasis being placed in different areas of the triangle. It may not be equilateral. In the earliest years of second language learning, students will be focused primarily on oral communication. Therefore, it makes sense to gather assessment data from observation and conversation. Moving into higher grades, there is a transition to balance between the 4 competencies, and therefore, more value may be placed on student products. Throughout the assessment process, Feedback and communication with both students and their families are vital to success. Communication should be designed to provide detailed information that will encourage students to set goals for learning, help educators to establish plans for teaching, and assist parents in supporting learning at home. Communication must go beyond formal reporting periods and parent-educator interviews and could include ideas such as sharing of portfolios, student-led conferences, phone calls, or informal reports. With the understanding of learning goals and success criteria, the collection of a range of data over time, and the establishment of a cycle of feedback, the FSL educator can accurately determine the learning that a student has accomplished. That evidence then results in a statement or symbol about how students are learning, that is, the assessment or evaluation of their learning. At this time, you may wish to pause the video to consider this question. Your voice and feedback support the development of future professional learning series. Please take a moment to complete the following survey with your team. Should you have any questions about this module, please send an email to omlta@omlta.org. These modules have been created under the leadership of the Ontario Modern Languages Teachers Association. The OMLTA is a nonprofit professional association that has been supporting French as a second language and international languages educators of all programs and grade levels since 1886. Today, it continues to be the leader in professional learning and advocacy, inspiring and connecting Ontario's French and international languages educators. These modules were designed to support FSL educator retention and recruitment by deepening the understanding of the directions, principles, and content of the Ontario curriculum policy documents for all three of the province's FSL programs: Core French, Extended French, and French Immersion. The OMLTA would like to thank the Ministry of Education for its financial support in developing this module. Special thanks is also extended to the educators who contributed their expertise and experience to the development of the modules.